Okay, so picture this. It's 1979, and an entire country gets turned upside down almost overnight. We're talking about Iran, a kingdom that had existed for thousands of years, suddenly becoming something totally new, an Islamic republic. This wasn't just a local event. It completely changed the power dynamics in the Middle East, and we're still feeling its effects all over the world today. So that's the big question, right? How does a country manage to completely overthrow its powerful king in the span of just 1 year? To really get how it all happened, we first need to look at the cracks that were already spreading through the kingdom long before it all came crashing down. So before all this kicked off, Iran was a kingdom of contradictions. On the surface, you had this image of a modern, powerful nation. But underneath all that, things were, well, really starting to boil over. All right, so the guy in charge was the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The word Shah is just the Persian title for a king, and he'd been on the throne for decades. Now, he had this huge vision for Iran's future, but that vision would ironically end up being the very thing that tore his country apart. The Shah had this massive program he called the White Revolution. The promise was progress, modernizing Iran, building new schools and hospitals, all that good stuff. But here's the thing. For a lot of Iranians, the reality felt completely different. They saw their long-held traditions and religious values getting pushed aside. A small, wealthy elite was living in luxury, while the gap between them and the poor just got wider and wider. And if you dared to speak out against any of this, you'd have to deal with the Savak, a secret police force that was absolutely feared. On top of it all, a lot of people felt like the Shah was just a puppet for the United States, which had a huge interest in Iran because of its oil. And what's really wild is how this anger started to bring totally different groups of people together. You had deeply religious Iranians who felt their entire way of life was under attack. You had university students who wanted more political freedom. You had factory workers who felt they weren't getting their fair share of the country's oil money. For this one moment in history, all these different people wanted the exact same thing. It was a perfect storm of discontent.
Okay, so you've got all this frustration just bubbling under the surface. But how does that turn into an actual organized revolution that can topple a king?
As people started looking for someone to rally behind, many of them turned to a powerful religious figure. Now, in a deeply religious country like Iran, leaders with the title of Ayatollah, which means a top-ranking scholar in Shia Islam, are incredibly respected. And the man who would become the face of this whole movement was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini.
Khomeini had been a fierce critic of the Shah for years, so much so that he was forced to live in exile, completely outside of Iran. But here's where it gets really interesting. Even from far away, he figured out a genius way to get his message out. He'd record his speeches on simple cassette tapes. Those tapes were then smuggled into Iran and copied over and over and over again. It was like the 1970s version of a message going viral. His calls for a return to Islamic values and an end to the monarchy reached every corner of the country, uniting all those different angry groups under one clear mission. The Shah had to go. And in 1978, things really caught fire. It started when a government newspaper published a nasty article insulting Khomeini. Protests erupted immediately. The government used force, and people were killed. And this is where a really powerful and tragic cycle began. In Shia tradition, you hold a mourning ceremony 40 days after a death. So 40 days later, huge crowds gathered to mourn the protesters who'd been killed. But those ceremonies turned into new, even bigger protests. That led to more violence, which created more martyrs to be mourned. And 40 days later, the crowds were even bigger. Each turn of the cycle fueled the next, and the movement just grew exponentially. By the end of the year, the numbers were just, wow, absolutely staggering. We're not talking about a few thousand protesters anymore. We're talking about millions. The streets of Tehran and other big cities were packed, day in and day out, with people from every walk of life, all shouting for the same thing. At this point, the Shah's government was pretty much paralyzed. And in those first few weeks of 1979, the old system didn't just break, it completely shattered. And it happened with breathtaking speed. And then the first huge domino fell. On January 16th, the Shah and his family got on a plane and left Iran. The official story was that they were going on vacation, but, everyone knew what that meant. He wasn't coming back. The monarchy was collapsing in real time. Just 2 weeks after the Shah fled, the man himself returned. After 15 years in exile, Ayatollah Khomeini landed in Tehran, and the welcome he got, it was literally one of the biggest crowds in human history.
Millions of people flooded the streets just to catch a glimpse. His return was the signal that a new era had truly begun. But there was still one huge question mark: the army. What were they going to do? Well, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place on February 11th. After days of intense fighting in the streets, the military leaders made an announcement. They were declaring neutrality. They weren't going to fight for the Shah anymore. And without the army's backing, the government had zero power left. It was over. The revolution had won. So getting rid of a king, that's one thing. But what do you replace him with? How do you build a whole new country from scratch? That was the next massive challenge for the revolutionaries. Well, to figure that out, they put it to a vote. They held a national referendum with a very simple question. And the result was just a total landslide. A mind-blowing 98.2% of voters said yes to creating an Islamic republic. That gave the new leaders a crystal-clear mandate to build a whole new system. So what is an Islamic republic anyway? It's a pretty unique idea. Basically, you can think of it as a blend. It takes parts of a modern government, like having a president and a parliament that people vote for, but it mixes them with the core principles of Islamic law. And then, at the very top of the whole structure, there's a supreme leader, a religious authority who has the final say on everything, even over the elected president. So they went about building this new state step by step. First came the referendum, which confirmed what the people wanted. Next, they had to write a brand new constitution, the rule book for this new government. And that constitution officially created the powerful position of the supreme leader, a role that Ayatollah Khomeini himself would hold for the rest of his life. But the story doesn't end there, not by a long shot. The revolution's consequences cast a long shadow that stretches all the way to today, impacting not just Iran, but the entire world. And one of the first and most dramatic fallout events was the Iranian hostage crisis. Here's what happened. Later that year, a group of revolutionary students, furious that the U.S. had let the exiled Shah come to America for cancer treatment, stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. They took 52 Americans hostage and held them for 444 days. This event just shattered relations between the United States and Iran, creating a deep hostility that has pretty much defined their relationship ever since. When you zoom out, the revolution's impact was just massive. For one, it completely flipped the balance of power in the Middle East. It also inspired other movements around the world that wanted to push back against the influence of big superpowers. It led to a horrifyingly long and bloody war when neighboring Iraq invaded, afraid that the revolution would spread across its own border. And of course, it created the unique and powerful government that still rules around today. You know, from the way countries deal with each other to even the price of gas, the echoes of 1979 are all around us. And that really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. How do the events of that single explosive year continue to shape the world that you and I live in right now?